This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 25 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Discussions at the Roundtable. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer, and today's guest is Mr. Robert Borders. Now, Mr. Borders is a longtime marketing consultant with Optimal Business Solutions, where he specializes in customer interactions and retention, process efficiency, and all aspects of direct marketing. Mr. Borders has assisted customers in a broad range of industries, ranging from entertainment to healthcare and beyond. He is a sought-after expert witness with over 30 years of experience. Mr. Borders, thank you so much for joining me here today at the Roundtable.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Let's jump into it. Let's talk a little bit about the expert's role. We talked a little bit before, we emailed a little bit before about what the expert's role is vis-a-vis the attorney. The expert's job is not to interpret the law. That is the attorney. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what exactly the expert witness's role is.
I like to, when I'm retained, I like to lay out exactly what everybody's role is, just as you mentioned. At no time do I ever talk about the law or reference the law unless the attorneys have told me to do so. What I bring and tell them is I have the industry experience that they lack. In order to be an expert, you have to have knowledge that's beyond the ken of the normal person. And in that role, what I like to do is talk about such things as industry standards, give examples of companies that abide by that standard so that if it's a jury trial, they can make a relation to what's going on. I like to talk about, when discussing with attorneys, I'd like to find out what has been done with regard to discovery. The reason for that is, in some ways, the attorney doesn't know what he doesn't know. And so in a legal perspective, I don't know what I don't know. So we both have that issue. That's basically how I try and separate the two roles.
Let's talk about those vetting phone calls. When you get a call on the phone and they have a case for you, how do you know whether or not, because as you stated, knowing what they don't know and not knowing what they don't know may be beyond the ken of the attorney. How do you know that you are the correct expert witness given the fact pattern that the attorney presents to you?
There's two things I do when I get the first call. I typically ask, is this all that you have? And that's from Roundtable or whomever, because there may be more information. And the more information I have, the better equipped I am to help the attorneys and become the expert. As the expert, one of the things depending on whom I'm talking to, but if it's the attorneys, I try and point out just that. I'm not going to talk about any of the legal issues, but there are some things that I believe are relevant and germane to this matter that you don't know. And here's some of the examples I have. Usually that ends up taking what's supposed to be a 5 or 10 minute call and turns it into a 35 minute call. I have no problem doing that because I'm educating the attorneys to some degree. It can also turn around and kick me in the butt because they pick up items that they haven't discussed, and as they speak to other potential experts, they'll ask questions about that.
As a neutral expert, how do you square that with also wanting to assist the attorney who's hired you?
One of the case I'll use is probably the one that I involved in it, and that was Publishers Clearinghouse around the turn of the century.
They're the ones who bring the big check to your door, right?
That's exactly right. And if you got a mailing, at least 6 or 7 times, it told you that you were the winner.
Right.
So one of the, as we were discussing this with the attorney and the group that was bringing us together, I had to point out that they looking to accomplish 2 things. And that was, one is this is deceptive advertising, this is misleading advertising, and there is a difference. So I said, yes, that's great, but you're missing something else, and that is that they're targeting seniors. And their response was, well, we know that, but we can't prove it. And I said, well, actually, it's not that difficult to prove. And I said, there's a company out there called SRDS, and what they have is they have a compendium of all sorts of lists. At the time, now it would have more website information, but then it had email information, it had direct mail, it had anything like that. And you could get a list of a list of a list. So if you wanted to have people who were over the age of 60 who lived in a neighborhood with 3 cars in the house, and there were 2 kids in the house, and he was a graduate of this type of institution, you could get a list of people such as that. What I did is I said, going back, I said, I can look at, if you still have Discovery open, I can look at these lists and we can determine where one of the selects they have is age. And by doing that, we can then zero in on the fact that they're targeting senior citizens.
Do you recommend that sort of proactive approach where the expert should be looking for possible holes or possible opportunities for the attorney who may not even realize something like that?
I do think it's part of as I mentioned, they know the law. I know the marketing aspects of it. And in this case here, they wanted to prove that there was targeting done to seniors, but they had to give up on it because they didn't know how. And that's where, if I can assist in that and bring something to their attention, everybody's a win in that situation.
Tell me a little bit about the behind the scenes when you're not in a deposition, when you're not in court. What is the interaction like with the attorney? What is that strategizing like? How do you organize your time, what you're going to say, what you're going to do prior to getting into the courtroom or into whatever venue you're going to do a deposition in?
But there's 3 different ways that we have those discussions. One is if I've written a report. If I've written a report, then, outside the deposition, there's a lot of strategizing and discussing about why did I put that in there? Should we leave it in there? Should we gloss over it, or should we support it? So that's the first one. If there's a report, it's a lot different in a situation when there's no report. The second is if there's no report, I will ask the attorneys, or they will tell me that these are the 3 major points we want to develop when we go into depositions or trial. And then the last one is what I call word on the street. And it's something that both the attorneys and I will have heard things, and we have discussions about. The attorneys can't bring it into the case, but I can. And one of the things they will sometimes say, well, while you're talking about A, see if you can slip in something about Q, so those are the type of interactions we typically have in a non-deposition or trial situation.
You mentioned report writing. Do you have a report writing strategy? Is there a way that you like to organize your reports? Do you like to use multimedia or images or anything like that in there?
All of the above.
Oh.
For my reports, I do have a format that I like to use. First is why I was retained, what the matter is. Next, I give some background on who I am and how I'm relevant to this matter. I then go into, typically, I not solely, but I typically work with defense counsel. Mm-hmm. And in that matter, I look at what the charges are, and I then write what I can to not necessarily refute them, but to point out holes in whatever the charge is. The second thing that I like to do is try and find examples of, people in the industry or individuals who have had some trial experience where I don't want the case law. I just want to be able to go onto the internet and find something that's relevant and try and include that. And then at the end, I try and summarize all of that. Where applicable, I do try and use charts. because if it's, especially if it's a jury trial, you're up there, you're talking for X number of hours. The jury is, some of this is going over their head, whatever. If you can show a chart that sums up, an hour of your testimony, the picture works very well in a graph or a photo. So I do include those.
Do you develop your own graphics?
Uh, when you say graphics, no, I can barely write my name, So, but what I can do is I'm rather good with stuff like PowerPoint. In my business, I learned to become very good with that. So I can use that to highlight important points or to refute points.
Besides a multimedia approach, as you indicated, how else do you connect with the jurors? How else do you keep them from, their eyes just glazing over with jargon?
I like to tell stories that everybody can relate to. There was one matter, an individual was, it was a criminal matter, federal court. An individual was running a $100 million business by, I'm trying to see if I can summarize it quickly, by going to people who had poor credit and offering them an opportunity to build their credit rating and giving them a credit card. It was
Sure.
a bogus credit card. So I was explaining the way they did this. They would call somebody up typically between the hours of 5 in the afternoon to 8 or 9 while somebody was eating dinner. They'd then throw out this thing. They were going to give them a stored value credit card, which was going to help them, blah, blah, blah. So the example I used is I said, imagine you're sitting down at the table, you can be married and you're there playing with the kids, wife's cooking, you're having food brought in, regardless of the situation, and you sit down in front of your dinner, and as you take your first bite of food, along comes this phone call. And for 90% of the population, phone calls take over whatever you're doing. You go right to it. And so I explained that, and in the marketing world, that's referred to as between the bite of the pork chop, because so you just had this bite and you're trying to swallow this and whatever, and you're talking to this guy, and he starts mentioning, we're going to improve your credit. We're going to give you a credit card, which is something they've never had before. And I tell them a story. And so the guy's looking at his dinner, says, this was great. He says, yes, he doesn't realize what he signed up for. So he hangs up the phone. He comes back to the dinner table and he either says to himself or he talks to the family, this is going to be great. We're going to have better credit rating and I'm going to have a credit card. And so I looked to the jury and I said, I'm sure that you've had a similar situation. And the jury sits there and they look at it and you can see the nodding of the head. And at that point, I remember the federal prosecutor looked at it and said, we had the case won as soon as you did that. So I like telling stories that the people, the jury especially, can relate to, or the judge can relate to.
And, that's a part of what you do for a career, right? Marketing, is telling a story to potential customers, right? So
Right.
What are some of the takeaways? What are some techniques that non-marketing professionals with storied careers can take away to more effectively communicate with juries and to judges during bench trials or even at depositions? What are some of those storytelling techniques that you can use?
The first is look at it from the point of the common man. I don't care, what type of case it is. I'm sure you can find or can easily think of something that is the common man has gone through or understands. And if you do that, in my mind, as soon as you do that, it's much easier to tell a story. Where typically, when I'm meeting with my attorneys, they'll sit there and say, okay, well, if you're doing that, be concise, don't go on for, half an hour. And they like that. And one of the things I find, if you have a good story, the attorneys will put that into their presentations or summations. So it works well for everybody.
You've been doing this for a while. Have you noticed any trends in the world of expert witnessing? Have things changed? In other words, are we moving towards more depositions? Is there more of an online component? Have you noticed any significant changes from when you started expert witnessing?
Well, there's definitely, um, online, um, everything used to be in the courtroom. Now, I mean, it's via Zoom or some other platform where you're doing a lot of this stuff like that. So that's one. Um, I think that's probably the most format. The other thing that I'm seeing is because of the internet, people, and this can be on either side of the aisle, and I'm not talking about the attorneys, I'm talking about the witnesses or the expert witnesses, too much of what they've read on the internet, they are now turning into fact, when in fact it's not fact, it's more opinion. And if you can identify that in advance, let the attorney know there's all sorts of objections, but I have to watch out that I don't do the same thing. Uh, so it's good, or the judge can point it out. But
Sure.
that's the biggest thing that I see is the difference between what is fact and what all of a sudden, because it was on the web, is opinion.
Have you been subject to what is colloquially, although it's not always technically, a Dobert challenge or challenge for your expertise?
Yes. The first, many times, as a matter of fact, the one thing I keep coming back to is the knowledge I possess is beyond the ken of the normal individual. And I didn't graduate college. I have 6 years. I don't have a degree, so during any Daubert challenge, that's the first thing they like to point out. He's not even a college graduate. To which, if you have smart attorneys, they say, well, neither was Einstein or neither was Edison, something like that. And so, so right away, the other side comes back and says, so you're saying that your expert is Edison. So yeah, you have to be careful. But I mean, I pick the areas that I believe the average man does not have any experience or expertise in. And I just stay with that.
Sure. And to kind of bring it back around with what you were saying with people getting information just kind of randomly off the internet, I was just thinking to myself, boy, I don't know if that would survive a Dobert challenge very well, right? If they're saying, hey, where did you get this information that you plan on presenting to the court? And you're like, oh, I read it on, Joe's Great Tips.web.
Right. Well, typically you find it after somebody has on the other side has become the expert and makes comments. So it's depending on how much information you have taken during the deposition, you can have a lot of fun with that. If you have a lawyer who likes to be sarcastic, it can be fun. If there's somebody who likes to just go right to the facts, that's a different story. But one way or the other, it's good to point that out. And I have to be aware of that also.
Sure. With somebody who has been doing this long enough, do you worry about things that you post on social media or things that you've written that maybe maybe your opinions changed, or maybe the technology has changed, or something else coming back to bite you during those sorts of challenges?
With regard to what I do in the business world, I don't put on social media. So for just that reason.
Sure.
Has technology changed things? And by all means, I used to be very involved in people who are using the phone to scam. They passed a law, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and I was considered expert in that. Today, nobody cares about that. I mean, so that's been a change. Is something I wrote about, their marketing is deceptive because they said this on the phone. You don't see that anymore. It's all
Sure.
whatever was on the email, what was in the website.
Has technology changed the either amount or types of cases that you are able to be an expert in? In other words, where you might not want to travel, 10 states away, you might be able to assist in a Zoom meeting, for instance. Has that something that's affected your career at all?
Not really. I mean, as part of my work right now, I have over 1 million miles on United Airlines.
So you're willing to fly.
Well, it's not even that I'm willing to fly. It's just that, I'm used to flying.
Right,
So.
sure. Speaking of venues, you have worked in a number of different venues. As an expert witness, are there significant differences in working for, say, state versus federal or other venues that have had something that's kind of thrown you off or surprised you in some way?
I don't know that I'd call it surprising, but in a federal venue, there's more money to be spent, which is the first thing. So better digs.
Sure.
So that's the one thing. The other thing I find is that when you're in a state, there can be anomalies in state A's law that vary from 49 other states. So that's one of the things that not that I have to worry. I don't worry about it. It's the attorneys worry about it, and they tell me. But the attorneys who are resident in that state have a field day because they're waiting for somebody to step in the trap. So you see that in a federal court, you don't see as much of that. In federal courts, in my opinion, decisions or challenges to objections are heard right then and there. There's not so much of in the chambers type of stuff. I think I see more of that in state courts than I do in federal.
Do you feel that the attorneys typically do a pretty good job preparing you for any important differences that there will be in a new venue that you hadn't worked in before?
Absolutely. The first couple of times I was an expert, I was going through, 15 to 20 hours of sitting there, and I wasn't charging for it. So I wised up real quick. But yes, there's been 2 or 3 matters that I can relate to. One was I live in northern New Jersey. The case was being held in Philadelphia, and for the better part of 3 weeks, I was making the 2-hour one-way drive to Philadelphia, and it was to spend 2 or 3 hours talking about this point in what our case was. So there's a fair amount of that. In my opinion, if you have a good attorney, that's one of the things they're going to want to do is spend time with you so everybody is on the same page.
One of the things that we emailed about prior to the show was, speaking of timing, attorneys contacting you with sufficient time to do your part as an expert witness, whether that's writing a report or, just taking in all of the paperwork and information and reading about the case. Do you feel that in general you do or don't have enough time to do your part as an expert witness when you're brought onto the case?
I'll answer that. There's 3 answers I have in it. One is where I do have enough time, where I have definitely enough time. The other is in which I think I have enough time, but as I delve into the case further, I say we have an issue here. And I mentioned before the discovery, that's where I said we're going to have, there's more work to be done. And they're saying, well, we have a trial date of blah, blah, blah. And I said, then I'm going to have to hire additional help, or you're going to have to supply somebody for me. And then the last one is we're on a tight schedule, but if you need more time, let us know. So I find that most of the time I'm given sufficient time, but there's, I'm going to say 20% of the time, especially if it's the larger the case, and when I say larger, I'm not just talking about dollars, but the larger the impact of the result of the case has, there tends to be more time allocated for it.
I'd like to ask about a couple general matters. One is just being an expert in your particular field, advertising is extremely broad, and your expertise within that field is also broad. How do you stay up on things in a way that you continue to be useful as an expert witness as the industry, the marketplace, the laws change?
Um, Well, I do read the industry public. First of all, is I don't have as much work as I used to, but I think that's in general. The other thing is it's simply reading and staying up with what's new. I mean, the publications, it used to be a thing called Ad Age or Ad Week. They're both around, but they have, much less items, you really have to hunt for information. But one of the things you can do is if I'm being told, listen, somebody is interested in you for this, I start paying attention to what's advertising. I mean, I'm lucky in that I guess about close to 40% of my career was in business to business advertising versus business to consumer.
Mm-hmm.
So just living an ordinary life, watching TV or whatever, you're going to see what's happening in terms of the marketing and advertising. There's a new term that's coming out now, and you go to your store to get people to buy more. It's the BOGO, buy one, get one.
Get one.
Right. And that's a real big thing now. There are people who think that that's doing nothing more except deceiving the customer, because if they had a price on week one, they had a price for 79 cents, and next week it's $1.79. And then when you buy one, get one, it's $1.15, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, another general question that I like to ask is, what is important about this? What is important about this work that we do as expert witnesses? Why should people be expert witnesses? What is the public good? What is the utility of expert witnesses to you?
I started to mention it first. What you're doing is you're going after the truth. I use Publishers Clearinghouse as one example. What you're doing is you're helping the average person. That's one of the another situation was involved in is and this happened to be a direct mail situation. They were capturing information, and there's a certain amount of private, they call it PCI, private confidential information. And they were offering you something that you never got, but by the time that happened, they had all your information. And they then sell that information. You get bombarded with junk mail, emails, and the like. So I'm trying to help the average person avoid some of that. And I think that's the reason I do it. I also think that if you can help the attorneys, because they're a major part in this, then again, you're helping the overall citizen.
You are somebody who is still heavily involved in your field while simultaneously working as an expert witness. Is it important to still be active in your field as an expert witness? Because there are a number of professional expert witnesses. Do you have an opinion on that?
I'm not a professional expert. I've come across them on numerous occasions. One of the things that I have done in the past is read their CVs, and you can see that there's one or two common things they do in every case, even though the issues in the case may be different. And I try and point that out to the individual who's making the decision or the attorney, depending on who it is. I think unless you're doing small claims court or stuff in a local situation, there's no such thing as, it's the same case. There's always something that's a little different. And I think that's one of the things that you can point out with the people who are the professional experts. The CV goes flying out. They probably send out 3 a week, regardless of what's happening. One of the things I get from everybody that I've worked with from attorneys general to attorneys is I get a reference saying this is what I did, this is how he helped, blah, blah, blah. And I make sure that those are included in anything that I forward.
Having worked on some larger, more complex cases, have you ever worked on teams with other expert witnesses?
Yes. The case I mentioned before that was in federal court, the individual who was being charged, he believed that he was helping people to the point that he would give away money to fund this charity. Now, he was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and he's giving away $10,000 or $12,000 to a charity. So one of the things that they did is he was saying, everything I'm doing is for the good of the people. And they brought in a psychiatrist to read his things in his depositions, spend time with him, run through that. They then brought in an individual who was running a legitimate credit improvement business, and they would talk about the differences between the individual business versus what his business was. And at that point, the attorneys would come in and say, okay, what was the role that I played? And I said, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a judge, but I can just tell looking at these two things from the marketing perspective, this is good, this is bad.
Sure. When you do work with other expert witnesses, to what extent do you interact with them, or do you at all interact with them, strategize with them, or share any report writing duties with them?
Usually not. There was one instance where I wrote a report. The attorneys who were handling the case passed the report on to another expert, not asking for her opinion, just simply saying this is what's going to be presented at trial.
In general, when you or a team are working with an attorney, what are the factors that lead to a good, mutually beneficial experience? What makes a quality engagement in general, in your opinion?
That the attorneys have done their homework, and I'm serious about that, and that in addition to having done their homework, enough time is spent. I have enough time to meet with them to ensure that we're all on the same page. What are the two? Every matter I've been in that's where we've won, there's always 2 or 3 things in advance that the attorneys want to have brought in, and if I've also been in a case where no, you're fine. You have your report. We'll just handle that. I feel in that situation, I'm flying without any support.
Wow. Before we wrap up, do you have any last advice for particularly newer expert witnesses?
Yes, as I said at the very start, their role is the law. Your role is the business that you're in. So make sure that they understand your role, and don't be afraid to tell them, this is what I think I'm going to need in order to help prove this case. So don't be bashful about it.
Sage advice. Thank you so much, Mr. Borders, for joining me here today.
Great. Thank you, Noah.
Of course. And thank you to our listeners for joining me for another discussion at the Roundtable. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Discussions at Roundtable. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com. Subscribe today on Apple Podcasts or your favorite listening apps.